Book of Malachi, the last book in your Old Testament. It's been sort of a long journey, I guess, in some respects, making our way through the Old Testament, but we've finally arrived and we fit it in a year. So that was good. A couple of Sundays that were, I guess you could say, on their own, but we've made it through the Old Testament, and I look forward to continuing in the New Testament, but not without looking at the book of Malachi. Malachi is filled with a lot of challenges, and I think that the reason why I've enjoyed this study of the Old Testament so much is sometimes people think about the Old Testament that it's got to be irrelevant because it's old and it doesn't have any application or relevance in our lives, and the more that you read through these stories, the more that you see application in your life and in my life as I look at the children of Israel and their attitudes toward God, for instance, about how we've said that one of constant lethargy has been on the pages of the Old Testament, where they're quite apathetic toward God because of their circumstances or because of things that were either in their control or out of their control, that they just found themselves being lazy toward God. And I can relate to that from time to time. Sometimes it's because of our circumstances that make us not so inclined to pursue God because maybe we're happy where we're at without Him. All kinds of things that jump off the pages to me in the Old Testament. Malachi is no different. Malachi is addressed to a group of people. Particularly, the focus is drawn to the priests, the leaders, the ones that were supposed to be setting an example for all of the other Israelites, the ones that were supposed to be leading from the front, the ones that you could say were the prime examples. Everyone was supposed to be looking to them so that they knew how to live or that they knew how to respond. These were the guys that were in charge, but they were the ones that were set apart for that specific reason, and they were letting themselves down, they were letting others down, and more importantly, they were letting God down. So God writes to them in Malachi chapter 2 and verse 1, "This is the declaration or the admonition that I have for you, O priest." And so with that in mind this morning, we want to think about some of those admonitions that God gives to the priest. My job as a priest, how that might relate to me. So let me put Malachi, I guess, in its proper place, and then we'll introduce the book. We've been all over the place in biblical history in these books of the prophets, especially in the minor prophets. Some of them, they specifically focus their attention on like the southern kingdom of Judah, but then others of them, they prophesy to Israel as a whole, and so they never really go in chronological order. It's kind of hard sometimes to know where you're at all of the time. And so Malachi is about 100 years after they have returned from captivity. Malachi is right in the middle part of these people that are really apathetic and lethargic toward God. They're not really on fire. They have no zeal. They have no passion. They're just tired and burned out, and they've grown cold, basically, toward God and His law. And Malachi is right in the middle of trying to help these people realize the error of their ways. And basically what he does is present two ideas to them. He says, number one, you can continue in your spiritual slide, in your spiritual spiral downhill. You can continue in that, and God's going to curse you, or you can change. You can see how you've fallen short. You can see and acknowledge the error that you have in your life and fix it and change, and God will bless you. It's really the same as all the other prophets, but this time Malachi has a problem, or God has a problem with those who are in charge, with the leaders and with the priests. And so with that in mind, we sort of put our focus on the book of Malachi at a time where people are struggling to be on fire for God. They're struggling to have great faith. They're struggling to move forward with their faith. And we zoom in on chapter 2 and verse number 1, like we said, "Therefore, this is a decree for all the priests." See the word therefore. We say as a Bible student, you have to see what it's there for. And so obviously it's a connecting word that draws our attention back to chapter 1. And essentially what you have is this description of the offerings that the people were bringing to God. The problem was twofold. Number one, the people were bringing sick offerings. The animals that they were bringing to offer to God as sacrifices, they were sick. They were blemished. They had problems and they had flaws. And you remember that one of the things that God expected in the law was that these animals not be blemished, that they not be sick, that they were the best of the best, not the leftovers. And so the problem in Malachi 1 is twofold. The people are bringing sick offerings, and the second problem is that the priests were accepting them. The priests were taking their sick offerings and then offering them to God. And that just disgusted God because the people would then give him the leftovers, their sick offerings, and then the priest had the audacity to accept it and offer it to them. And so as a result of their giving God what was left and them giving God what was sick and them not living up to the standard that God expected of them as priests, God has a decree for them. And so what we might be tempted to do is to check out a little bit because we say, well, what does this have to do with me at all? Because I'm not a priest. I don't live under the old covenant. So what's the connection here? And I would argue that there's a greater connection than maybe we realize. That the word priest doesn't just describe a select group of people in the Old Testament. It actually describes every Christian in the New Testament. That's a word that God gave to every Christian in the New Testament to describe their function and their relationship to Jesus, the great high priest. When you read through the book of Hebrews, specifically chapter 4 and chapter 7, there are two indications where Jesus is this great high priest that fulfilled the sacrifice for sin for all, one time by Jesus' sacrifice in Hebrews chapter 4. And that qualifies him to be the great high priest. And as a result of his being our high priest, we in turn, in response to that, are his priests. We serve as priests. 1 Peter 2 and verse 9. We are a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a chosen people for his own possession. That's how Peter describes us. In Revelation chapter 1, verse number 5 and 6, John says this about the church. He says, in response to Jesus and the fact that he shed his blood for us, we are a kingdom and we are priests. And that's how he describes every Christian in the New Testament. And so I would argue this morning that the fault of the priest in Malachi chapter 2, the issues that God brings out that he has with the priest might very well be our temptations too. And so the way I want to frame the lesson is I want to point out 5 detrimental problems that the priests had in Malachi chapter 2, and then probably tonight, because I don't think we'll have time, to get to 5 necessary lessons that the priests had to learn. And both of those, I think, will be really good for us as priests that serve under our great high priest, Jesus. So for the time being this morning, let's just focus on these detrimental problems that the priests had. And of course, if we get there, we get there. If we don't, then we don't. But 5 detrimental problems that the priests had in Malachi chapter 2 that we might see in our own lives from time to time. I read not too terribly long ago about a coach who had lost his job for some inappropriate behavior. And that's all that the article said, inappropriate behavior. But the writer that was writing this article at the bottom said that this coach embarrassed himself by acting with conduct that was unbecoming of his profession. If I could describe Malachi 2 in any way, shape, or form, that would be it. That the priests were acting in their conduct in a way that was unbecoming of their profession. That because they were priests, there was a standard. God expected them to live a certain way. In fact, he expected them to live different than the people that were around them. Of course, the Israelites as a whole, the general population, if you will, they were expected to live holy lives too. But the priests, it's like they were in a fishbowl. They were the ones that were supposed to be the eyeballs of everybody. They were supposed to be in the gaze of everyone. Everyone's looking at them, watching them to see how they act and how they respond and how they live. And as a result of how the priests are acting and setting an example, then of course the people would follow. And you really stop and you think about how that relates to us. And just for a second, you think about your responsibility as a Christian. You think about how the world looks at you, and you're always in the gaze of the critics, and you're always in the gaze of the skeptics, and you're always in the gaze of the people that are constantly looking for you to mess up. And so they can justify their behavior because you as a Christian aren't living up to the standard that you claim to possess in your own life. It happens that way all the time. And they watch us, and they want us to fail. They want us to fall, and they want us to mess up so they can easily say, well, you're not living the way that you're supposed to. And we also know the other side of the coin too, that sometimes people will never become a Christian because of the way that I live. And so it really lights a little fire under me. It gives me a little bit of extra zeal or a little bit of extra passion to do what's right and to be a good example so that when others do see me, they see a good picture of God and a faithful picture of Jesus and a faithful picture of their love. And they want to respond to Jesus because of that. And so as we give our attention then to Malachi chapter 2 and these detrimental problems, it starts right here with this. They dishonored God's holiness. You know, Joey talked this morning a little bit at the beginning about honoring God as awesome. And there's an interesting phrase right here in verse number 2 that catches my attention. It says, if you don't listen, remember, God is speaking through Malachi to the priests, the leaders, the examples, the one that are supposed to be doing right. If you don't listen and you don't take to heart to honor my name, says the Lord of armies, I will send a curse among you, and I will curse your blessings. In fact, I have already begun to curse them because you are not taking it to heart. So essentially, when he addresses their superficial religion, because by the way, they're still offering sacrifices. That's what we learned in chapter 1. They're just offering 6 sacrifices. They're not offering what God expected. So they're doing what's right. Their heart's not in it. It's superficial religion. And the first way that probably their superficial religion came about, the way that it developed, the way that it continued to grow, was because of what you find in verse number 2. They refused to honor God's name. They dishonored God's holiness. In other words, when you see this not honoring God, it carries along with it the idea of God having no weight or heaviness in their lives. Like they didn't think that God was valuable is essentially the idea. That God held no weight, no import in their life. There were other things that were more important than God and His holiness to them is essentially the idea. That they reduced God down to someone who just gave them some blessings from time to time, and there were other things that were elevated in God's place that actually meant more to them. And so there's a problem there. I think it was A.W. Tozer that said, what you think about God is the most important thing about you, and the priests tell us everything we need to know about them. There were other things that were more important to them than God was, and God had an issue with that. There was something wrong with the priest's attitude and their mentality toward their position and their obligations as priests, but more importantly, toward their attitude with God. And God had an issue with that. Listen to verse 2 again. If you don't listen, that is, with the intent to obey, to set your heart and your mind with the intent to obey, or if you don't set your heart, some translations say. Others say, if you don't take it to heart, that is, to actually decide that you're going to do something with it. Actually decide that you're going to let it impact your life. Hear intelligently with the implication of obedience, with actually trying to apply it and letting it take root in your heart. That's what verse 2 is all about. We know from chapter 1 that they didn't do that. They didn't do that because they were giving 6 sacrifices to God. They were offering cheap sacrifices, worthless sacrifices. God carried no weight. They listened to God's word, but they didn't have any intent to obey it. They didn't let it take root in their heart. There was no active decision of the will to do something good with God's advice and admonitions to them, and that's a problem with God. I want you to notice also something that begins in verse number 2, and it continues throughout the chapter. You see the phrase in verse 2, Lord of armies. Some of your Bibles might say, Lord of hosts, or might say Lord Almighty. All of those are the same. They translate essentially to the same thing. And that's about the strongest title that God could use to let the priests know that He was serious and that He had a backing of angelic armies behind Him to bring forth His wrath on them if they didn't clean up their lives, if they didn't fix the problems that were going on. God had a backing of angelic armies behind them. And you know what they did to that? They yawned. They didn't care. They had no desire to change, even when God says, I've got an angelic army behind me. I'm the Lord of hosts. And it still didn't matter. They dishonored God's holiness. They looked at God and said, you mean nothing to us. You're not important to us. We have other things that matter more to us than you, oh God. And that's a problem. They obviously had no concern or care for God. But because of His love and grace, He still offers them a chance to return. Look at that first word in verse number 2. If. It's a condition. He's saying, if you will listen, I'll bless you. I'll continue to honor you. I'll give you what you want. But if you don't, then I'm going to curse you. There are going to be consequences as a result of your unwillingness to grasp and honor me and my name and my holiness. 3 things are going to happen to them. Number 1, God's going to rebuke them. You see it right there in verse number 3. Look, I am going to rebuke your descendants. It also includes, I think, in verse number 2, that idea of cursing. And sometimes when we think of the word curse, two things come into our minds. Some words we can't say, those are curse words. But then if we say, we're going to put a curse on you, maybe you're watching a Halloween movie or some sort of, witch stuff or something. I don't know what y'all watch on TV, but maybe somebody puts a curse on somebody else. Then we think, something bad's going to happen to them. That's all it is. It's just something bad is going to happen to the other person. But in Malachi's day, it was more than that. Like, inherent in the word curse was this excessive amount of doom and an excessive amount of destruction. And so we're talking more than just, having a flat tire on the way home from work, or, something happening bad to you, like, somebody breaking into your house or something. We're talking about excessive doom and destruction that God is saying is going to come to them. And you see the word blessings in verse number 2 also. God's not talking about what they receive from God. He's talking about what they're giving to Him. He's saying, I will put an excessive amount of doom on you because of what you're giving to me. The blessings that you're offering to me, they're sick, they're cheap, they're worthless, they're no good. And as a result of you dishonoring me in that way, there will be an excessive amount of doom, an excessive amount of destruction that comes your way because of the way that you have chosen to dishonor me. He says, I'm going to send it on you. I will send a curse. It's to hurl, to throw at them. There's going to be no holding back in God's response to them. And he says in verse number 3, look, I will rebuke your descendants. That is, the way the priests were living in that moment, it was even going to affect their descendants down the road. Maybe that's something we need to think about more often. That's something that's changed in my own life in the last 3 months, about the way that I say things and the way that I do things, how that might affect what I have coming up behind me, and what he might hear and what he might see. And maybe we need to think about that more, how what we're doing affects the generations that are coming up behind us and that are listening to us, how that changes the way we act. God says that about them. I'll rebuke even your descendants. They will be beneficiaries of the punishment that you'll get because of the way that you're acting right now. They were going to be rebuked. The second thing that was going to happen to them was this idea of rejection. Now, I hope you haven't eaten breakfast yet. Because what you're about to read in verse number 3 is strong, and it's kind of nasty, but it hopefully will help us get the point and to understand how serious God was about this issue of them not honoring His name and not respecting His holiness. It's a strong statement, right? Look at verse 3. Look, I'm going to rebuke your descendants, and I will spread animal waste over your faces, the waste from your festival sacrifices, and you will be taken away with it. Then you will know that I sent you this decree so that my covenant with Levi may continue, says the Lord of armies. So here you have this image. Let me give you a little background, what God's saying about the animal waste in verse number 3. So when the priest would take the sacrifices onto the altar, maybe in Alabama, this is a good way. Even if you don't hunt, you probably know about this. In Alabama, or really in the South generally, when a man kills a deer, after he kills the deer, before he drags it out of the woods, he does something called field dressing. And he'll cut the deer down the middle of his body, all the way through on his belly, and he'll get all the inside gross stuff out of the way. There's guess two purposes for that. It makes it really light when you're dragging the deer out of the woods. You don't have any extra guts and all that stuff. But also it gets all the nasty things out of the way so that you can get to the good meat, basically is it. And that's what the priests had to do. They had to get all of the insides, the guts, the waste, the excrement, all that stuff out of the way of their offering so that they could offer that which was pure to God. And so the priests, they would have done that. They would have gotten all the guts and all the insides and all the nasty stuff out of all that nasty stuff out of their offering. They would have had all that set to the side. And God says it's as if He's going to take all that nasty stuff and then smear it all over their faces. That's pretty gross. If you're not squirming now, you will be in just a second. He says, I'm not just going to take all that guts and stuff that you had out set aside, but then I'm going to rub it all over your face. That's disgusting, right? You know how people, when they kill their first deer, somebody rubs a little blood on their face, and then I've seen some dads go way too far, and they'll paint their whole kid's face, and the kid's throwing up and stuff, and it's pretty funny sometimes. But anyway, that's pretty gross. That's blood, but we're talking about the nasty stuff. I mean, this is absolutely disgusting. And you read verse 3 and you're like, what is happening? Why would God do something like that? Why would He put waste, dung, or manure, or even the worst of the animal? Why would He rub it all over the priest's faces? And He says, because you haven't honored my holiness. Because you don't respect me, because you don't see me of any weight or import in your life, because you don't see what I have to offer for you, I'm going to take this waste and I'm going to rub it on your faces. Can you imagine the image of self-righteous leaders up in front of all the people standing there with just the insides of an animal rubbed all over their faces? It was a humiliating picture. A humiliating picture. I wouldn't have wanted to see it. I wouldn't have wanted to have been a priest that have been a recipient of having that done to me in that moment. But I know this. God communicates to them that they have rejected Him, and in response to their rejecting Him, He was going to reject them. That He won't stand for superficial worship. That He won't stand for sloppy, half-hearted service. That God wants them to honor Him. As a result of their rebuke and rejection, look what else He says in verse 3 rather. I'll spread the animal waste over your faces, the waste from your festival sacrifices. And notice this last phrase, and you will be taken away with it. Some translations say, and you'll be carried away with it. This idea of removal. When the priest cleaned out the waste or the insides of these animals, they were supposed to throw it away. They were supposed to get rid of it, but for whatever reason they weren't. I'm not sure why they weren't getting rid of it, but God says, you didn't do what you were supposed to do. You didn't honor me. I'll show you what's supposed to be done. Because you rejected me, I'll rebuke you, and you're just going to be taken out. You're going to be carried out like the waste that you are. You're going to be carried out like the trash that you are. You're not honoring me, and I'm going to show you what that's like to not honor me. I'm going to carry you off with it. I know this from this very first point in Malachi chapter 2 about them dishonoring God's holiness. God is not passive about how we treat His name. God is not passive about how we respond to His holiness. God's not just going to let things go when we dishonor Him. He's not going to allow anyone to prosper when they live in rebellion to His honor and to His goodness and to His grace. Why? It goes back to Malachi chapter 1 and verse 2, and we didn't read it, but it says this. God says, I have loved you, says the Lord. He loves us way too much. He loved them way too much for them to keep living the way that they were. He wanted them to change, and that starts by having a proper understanding of honoring God and respecting Him. Detrimental problem number 2 with the priest. Detrimental problem number 2, they turned from the way. Look down at verse number 8. Sandwiched in between verses 2 and 3 and verses 8 and 9 are verses 4, 5, 6, and 7. Those are the lessons we'll look back at tonight probably. But look down at verse number 8 and notice another problem that God points out through Malachi with the priest. He says, you, on the other hand, have turned from the way. You have turned from the way. The first step south, headed towards superficial religion, is to treat God as if He has no weight or import in your life. That's what they had done. They were not honoring God. He's not important. But when you take that step, the next town you enter on your journey towards superficial, fake, sloppy religion that God hates, it's right here with this. It's when you depart from what you know is right. And that's what he says in verse number 8. You, on the other hand, have turned from the way. The New Living Translation says, you have left God's path. I like that phrase. You have left God's path. You, priest, we're looking back at Levi. That's the comparison here when he says you, on the other hand. Levi was the original priest, basically, where the priesthood began was with Levi. And he says Levi, he obeyed. Levi honored. Levi respected. But you, on the other hand, you've left God's path. You decided that God wasn't important in your life. You decided that there were other things more important than God in your life, and now you've turned from the way. You've departed from the right path. You're no longer walking where you should walk once you stop walking with God. Your influence is ruined. That's what happened with the priest. You know, I think how quickly that phrase could be summarized up in my own life, or how real it becomes when I start to think about those times where I have almost inevitably put something more important than God in my own life. I've elevated something more important than God into His place. That's the way I see it. And how quickly I find myself veering off the path of right. How far sometimes you go down the path of wrong before you realize that it's because God isn't in His proper place in our lives. I'm sure that we can relate to the priest when we see that they turned from the way. Detrimental problem number 3 in Malachi chapter 2. They destroyed the faith of others. Look at verse 8 again. You, on the other hand, have turned from the way. Listen to this. You have caused many to stumble by your instruction. The truth of the matter is, when I quit doing right, usually I take other people with me. Don't you see that sometimes in your life? Maybe you remember that from when you were younger, or maybe you see it in your kids or in your grandkids, or maybe you just look at the general public and you see that when usually one person who is a leader in the group is not doing right anymore, then by implication or by extension, everyone else that's around them is not doing right either. 1 Corinthians 15 in verse number 33, right? We say that sometimes. Bad company corrupts good morals. I heard that 1,000,000 times growing up, right? Be careful who you hang out with, because if you're not careful, then you'll end up doing those same things that they're doing. You say, well, that won't affect me. And maybe you feel that way, but I haven't met anybody that strong. It just doesn't work like that. That when you surround yourselves with people that are just bad and miserable and wretched people, well, then sometimes their bad, miserable, and wretched attitudes, they overflow into your life and into your heart. And sometimes those things that they do, they appear in your life. And you wonder why it happens. That's because when people turn from the way, when they get away from God's path, they usually end up taking other people with them. When we all influence someone, that's the truth. And when I grow cold in my faith, then I'm probably going to cause others to ice over too. Look at what happens in verse number 8. They cause many to stumble by their instruction. That to me is crazy. It's like God says, the things that you're saying, the things that you're doing, people are looking at you and they're falling away because of the things that you're saying. Instead of pointing people toward God, which is your job as a priest, instead of building a bridge between God and those people, you are tripping them up. You're pulling the boards up off the bridge. You're the ones cutting the rope so they fall. You're not leading them upward toward God. You're driving them downward and away. In Isaiah 9, in verse 16, Isaiah says something similar. He says, those who guide the people, they mislead them, and those who are guided are led astray. The leaders were corrupt, and as a result of corrupt leaders, the people that were following followed them away. Jesus had no tolerance for this either. In Matthew 18 and verse 6, He said, but if anyone causes one of these who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. The problem that God had with these priests was that not only did they not see God as important, but as a result of their dishonorable actions, other people started to follow them. Problem number 4 with the priest in Malachi chapter 2. They were violating the covenant. That they had a responsibility to hold up their end of the deal. A covenant is a two-way promise. God says, I promise to do this if you promise to do this. And it only is successful if both parties hold up their end of the deal. And God always holds up His end. But the problem with the people is that they weren't. Look at verse 8. You have caused many to stumble because of your instruction. Now, next phrase, you have violated the covenant of Levi, says the Lord. Now, this covenant with the priest that he's talking about, it traces all the way back to Levi. You remember that we said that Levi was the original priest. Every priest in the Old Testament was from the tribe of Levi. You can always remember that. All priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. You need to know that every priest in the Old Testament comes from the tribe of Levi. They had a special responsibility to deal with the temple and the tabernacle as it pertains to sacrifices and worship. That was their specific job. And so it traces all the way back to a covenant that God had with Levi, and He honors Levi as one that honors Him. He says, this is a guy that did what was right. He respected me and he honored me, and you have ventured far away from that. And the purpose of this covenant was to produce love and faithfulness in the hearts of those people between man and God, and they violated it. In fact, the word in verse number 8 for violated is to destroy. It's an idea that carries corruption or decaying. It's chipping away in small pieces until ultimately it's just gone altogether. And that's what happened. Over time, they just decayed and decayed and decayed, and ultimately there was nothing there. It's like in Genesis 6 and verse 12, when we're talking in terms of the flood, God saw how corrupt the earth had become, and all the people on it were corrupted in all of their ways. The same is true in Malachi chapter 2. They violated the covenant. They had become so corrupt that God saw how their decay had just ultimately led to their demise, and God was sick of it. God was sick of their sin and sick of their dishonoring Him, and so He says, you are caving in. You're corrupted. You've violated our covenant. You've broken your promise to me, and that broke God's heart. Problem number 5 with the people. They were despised by the people. These leaders, the examples that were supposed to be the ones pointing people to God, the people despised them. Look at verse number 9. So I, in turn, have made you despised and humiliated before all the people, because you are not keeping my ways, but you are showing partiality in your instruction. It's ironic that the priests, to me, were accepting substandard sacrifices in large part because they didn't want the people to get mad at them, really. That's what God says, but in their partiality, in their instruction. So in chapter 1, I told you, they're accepting these sick offerings. Twofold problem. The people are offering sick offerings, and the priests are accepting them. It seems, as you read the book of Malachi, that the reason the priests accepted their offerings because they didn't want to have to say, I'm sorry, we can't accept that offering because it's sick. They would rather be cool with the people than they would with God. They would rather the people be okay with them and be nice to them and say, oh, thank you, Mr. Priest, rather than doing what God wanted to do. So they were more concerned with what the people had to say about them than what God had to say about them. And that's a dangerous place to be. And so as a response to that, God says, okay, well, here's what's going to happen. It seems that always in the minor prophets, there's an allusion to this remnant. That there's always a good group of people. There's always a group of people that are actually trying to be faithful and that are actually trying to do right. And God uses those people to show the priests that there are some people that actually stand for right. And they see that you're wrong and they don't respect you. You have lost your reputation and you have lost your influence in the eyes of the people that are trying to do right. They despise you. You are humiliated in their eyes, and that's a problem. Because of their spiritual freefall, they not only were rejected by God, but now He says they're rejected by the people. Their sham was over. They couldn't fake anybody out anymore. God could see right through their hypocritical nature and their hypocritical actions, and He called them out for what they were. If we don't take our relationships with God seriously, then I promise you this, no one else will either. No one else will either. No one else is going to look at us and say, man, that's a good Christian if I'm not trying to be a good Christian. No one else is going to want to be a Christian or want to come to church or want to be like God or want to respond to Jesus if I'm not showing them what that looks like. I sometimes usually show people more what it looks like to be lost than I do what it looks like to be saved. That's a bad problem with us today. Not us as far as Chisholm Hills is concerned. I'm just saying Christianity at large. Sometimes we don't really show the world what it looks like to be saved. And that's God's problem with the priest. You're supposed to be setting an example for these people. You're supposed to be leading them upward toward God, and you're not, because you've dishonored God. You've dishonored me. And as a result of that, I'm rejecting you and the people are rejecting you. I would like to stop here this morning, mainly because I'm out of time and I have a long way to go. So we'll pick up these lessons tonight. But let me say this. Let me just use the time we've had together this morning as a challenge for God's people this morning. We are priests. That's what the New Testament declares, that we serve as priests under the lordship and the rulership of our great high priest, Jesus Christ the King. And the responsibility that we have is much the same as the priests of the Old Testament. The word for priest in the Latin is bridge builder. They had a responsibility to take the people to God by way of their prayers and their way of their service and the way of their worship. And our responsibility is exactly the same, to take people to God. And how we do that sometimes is a struggle. We too find ourselves in situations like the priest where we grow cold toward God. And when we grow cold toward God and we don't treat Him as if He's important and weighty and really matter in our lives, then we see how we venture off the path from time to time. And it might be a long way down the wrong path before we ever realize we ventured off. And we look around us and we see that there are people that are near us in close proximity to us, not because of their own decisions, but maybe in large part because of my inability to do what's right. I take people with me when I do what's wrong because they look at me as an example. And they look at me as someone that they thought could lead them to God. And because of my inability to do what's right, I've led people down the wrong path. Here's my challenge to you this morning. Take your role as a priest extremely serious. Let that start at the very top by honoring God as the most important thing in your life. By never letting anything take the place of God. Make it an extreme resolve of yours to walk that straight and narrow path, to do those things that honor God, to bring as many people to heaven with you as we possibly can, to be serious about taking our role as a priest as something that is special and honorable and even a privilege. And most importantly, let our hearts be constantly on fire to honor God and lift Him up as awesome like He really is. Maybe you're not a Christian this morning. You have an opportunity to become a priest, to serve under the leadership and the lordship of Jesus Christ, to be one who has a special ability and a special privilege to help other people see God. You have an opportunity to do that this morning, to obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. Maybe you are a priest. You have been for some time. You've been a Christian, but you've failed in your duties. You've become relaxed in your duties. You've realized that there are other things that have taken place, or maybe you've walked down the wrong path, or maybe there's others that have fallen away because of the things that you've said or the things that you've done. Maybe today you just need to realize that you need to lift God up as awesome in your life. You can do that right now as we stand and as we